That's the number one question I get. Doesn't that have salt in it? It doesn't have salt in it. It has salt on it. The water that's in the seaweed is just H2O. The water that's on the seaweed is sea water, if you're getting it from the ocean. Hey, it's Greg here with maritimegardening.com, and I thought what I'd do today is the ultimate gardening with seaweed video. I was just collecting seaweed with a friend the other day, and it's like January 3rd, I think, or January 2nd. And it's been a very, very mild early winter. But if I'm going to do anything with this, I got to do it now because it's going to freeze solid really soon. So it's a good time to do this video. And I've done videos on this topic over the years. I get a lot of questions on it. And I've sort of spoken to seaweed intermittently in various videos. I did a fairly thorough video on seaweed about 4 years ago, but the audio was poor and that sort of thing. So I thought it was just time to do sort of a more comprehensive video with better quality video and audio. So here we are. So number one, to speak to the sort of NPK, right? Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium values of seaweed. It's got an N of 2, a P of 0.25, and a K of 3.5. Those are rounded off values, and if you go online, you'll get, values around those, depending on what you're looking at, okay? Often the phosphorus is rated at 0 because they just round it down. It's basically not a great source of phosphorus, okay? But you've got an N of 2, K of 3.5, excellent source of potassium, okay? Now, the number one, and of course those things, it's not like fertilizer. If you get a fertilizer that's NPK of N, 2.5 and 3.5, that's immediately going into your soil. When you add this to your soil, whether you're working it in or just putting it on as a mulch like I do, it has to be broken down by the soil organisms for those things to be plant available, okay? So, depending on how quickly it breaks down, that's how quickly it's going to be available to the plants. Luckily, seaweed, as opposed to other mulches or soil amendments, breaks down very fast compared to like leaves or grass clippings or that sort of thing, right? It breaks down fast, but we'll talk more about that as we go along. Salt. Well, with salt, that's the number one question I get. Doesn't that have salt in it? It doesn't have salt in it. It has salt on it. Okay, there's no salt. The water seaweed is mostly water. So when you pick up 10 pounds of seaweed, you've got about 9 pounds of water there. I'm just being approximate here, okay? It's mostly water. The water that's in the seaweed is just H2O. The water that's on the seaweed is sea water, if you're getting it from the ocean. And of course, if you're getting it from a lake, of course, there's no salt. And you can use either, okay? It doesn't matter if you get it from a lake or from the ocean, right? It really doesn't. It's all good stuff, okay? So yes, you can get it from a lake. But in terms of the salt, if you're getting it from the ocean or an inland sea that has salt in it, when you smell your seaweed, it's got a smell. It smells like the ocean. So in your brain, in your mind, you're thinking that's salt. No, it's the smell of the ocean. Okay, you really don't, get a bowl of salt and smell it. It doesn't smell like the ocean. Okay, so what you're smelling there is the smell of the ocean, which is a whole bunch of different chemicals and minerals and so on and so forth. And the seaweed is mineral rich. It's got a lot of things in it besides NPK. There's salt on the ocean water that's on the seaweed has salt in it, but not a lot. So I've got a wheelbarrow here full of seaweed. That entire wheelbarrow might have a tablespoon of salt, because it's the salt that's in the ocean water that's on the seaweed. Okay, so most of the weight here is the weight of the seaweed and the water that's in it. All right, so to speak to that, if you're doing what I'm doing here, mulching your gardens with the seaweed in late fall, and this is early winter really, but that seaweed's going to be snowed on, rained on, thawed on, and this all depends on where you live, right? But if you're using seaweed, you're probably somewhere coastal, so your weather's probably like mine, variable all over the place. Just in the last 2 weeks here, we've had minus 10 Celsius and plus 10 Celsius. This whole area has been completely covered in snow, and now there's no snow at all, right? So it's coastal areas have bizarre climates, a lot of shifts because it's highly influenced by you know, the ocean currents and whatever's going on with that, right? So suffice it to say, if you put the seaweed mulch on your garden in late fall or even early winter like I am here, and everything's frozen today. The ground has basically got about 2 inches of frost in it. It's -4 Celsius today. That seaweed is going to be rained on, thawed, rained on, thawed. You know, even if you've got fairly consistent temperatures in winter and everything freezes up, eventually it's going to thaw, and everything's going to thaw before you plant. And all the salt that was in the water that was on the seaweed is going to go wherever the water goes, right? When it rains wherever you are, the water doesn't accumulate, right? It goes somewhere, right? Some of the water from the rain sort of sticks to the soil particles in your soil, and the rest of the water goes wherever it is water goes. It goes downhill to somewhere else, and all the salt that's attached to the water molecules, to the H2O molecule, you know, water and salt have an affinity for one another. So all the salt that's attached to the water, it's going to go wherever the water goes. Okay, so if you're mulching with seaweed this time of year, you don't have to worry about it being, you know, adding salt to your soil. It's just, there's very little salt in it anyway. And over the course of the winter and this early spring, whatever salt's there is going to go wherever it is water goes, right? Downhill and away, or deep down into the ground, right? So I wouldn't worry about that. So do not worry about the salt in the seaweed. How to gather seaweed. For me, you want to get the dead seaweed that's above the high tide mark, and you can usually tell just from the coloration of the sand or the rocks where you're gathering it where high tide marks. It's basically lighter in color and, you know, further up, right? It's good to gather the seaweed after a good storm. Number one, you know it's been rained on a lot. Number two, storms tend to push a lot of seaweed in off the ocean, so you're getting a lot of new seaweed, right? That hasn't been sitting there on the beach for weeks and weeks and weeks. And there's a good reason you want that. Because, you know, that's another point. If you're really high up on the beach, right next to the side of the road perhaps, I would stay away from gathering seaweed that's adjacent to just the wild weeds that are growing on the shore, or seaweed that's been there a long time. Because basically all the weed seeds that are on the shore, from the plants that grow on the shore, they're all going to get into the seaweed. So you want to get the fresher seaweed that's been pushed up by a storm that hasn't been there for ages, and seaweed ideally that's not right up against, you know, whatever wild weeds are growing on the edge of the ocean, okay? Because it'll tend to have, you know, I've done that, I know that from experience. There's a number of weeds, that especially lamb's quarters, because if you go to any beach in Nova Scotia, you're probably going to find, that's where I live, Nova Scotia, Canada, lamb's quarters just growing wild on the beach. And yes, lamb's quarters is edible, and it's a wonderful sort of the wild vegetables I can think of, it's one of the better ones. It's very similar to spinach in flavor. But you don't want it everywhere. You want it where you want it, you don't want it where you don't want it. Anyway, there's a lot of weeds that can be in that if it's growing next to wild weeds on the side of the road at the edge of the shore. Okay, so gather it after a storm, that way you're sure to get sort of the newer stuff, the fresher stuff. Also, wherever it is you're gathering seaweed, make sure you're not breaking any local laws. I mean, my understanding of the rules here where I live is that you can gather dead stuff. You can't be ripping the live stuff off the rocks. In addition, depending on where you are, it may be the case that the stretch of shoreline you're gathering seaweed from is someone's land. So get permission, you know, I'm sure if you're introverted, this is a terrifying thing to do, but knock on the person's door. I guess because we're in the middle of COVID-19, stand 6 feet away, but ask the person if you can collect seaweed from their shoreline. Right, so if there's a piece of shore that looks, you know, accessible to you, there's a house on one side where you're going to access, and the house on the other side, you got to talk to both those people and ask them, right? And if they're, you know, if you're charming and nice and presentable, and you know, ask them, you know. So I mean, there's a place I go where they say, sure, you can gather the seaweed, but don't back your vehicle up to that point on the beach. Fine, right? So. Where I go, I have to pick the seaweed. I haven't backed my vehicle right up next to where I'm getting the seaweed. I have to pick it up and walk about I don't know, 25 or 30 feet with each container. So you just use smaller containers, right? There's a big one behind me here. I basically just put that in the vehicle and I, add to it. You just take more trips. That's perfectly fine if it helps me maintain the relationship with the person whose land I'm crossing to get to the seaweed, okay? Where I live here in Nova Scotia, there's places that are just public that you can get it from, of course. But yeah, it may be the case that you have a place that looks public, it's actually somebody's land. Just knock on a couple doors and get permission, all right? That's it. How to apply as a mulch. I'm gonna do a bit of that here towards the end of the video just to show you. But for me, it's 2 to 3 inches. Do it in the fall and just put it right on the garden bed. Anywhere you've got bare soil, get the seaweed on there. And as I said before, you do that in the fall so that any salt that's in there, the rain's going to sort of take that salt away, what little bit of salt is there. But you're also just getting a mulch in your garden. Even if it's a garden bed where you don't want to have seaweed during planting season, just lay it all out, right? Instead of having it in a container, just lay it all out in your soil. You can pick it up and move it somewhere else later, next spring when things thaw out. During growing season, if you're going to add the seaweed, there might be a bit of salt in there. Some plants are really salt sensitive and some aren't. Okay, so yes, there's a tiny amount of salt in the seaweed. If you're growing something that's really sensitive to that, if you put the seaweed on, there's a good rain, the plants are going to take off a bit of that salt when that rain happens. So if you're concerned with that, and again, there's a whole wheelbarrow full of seaweed has a tablespoon of salt. Just take the seaweed and throw it on the ground somewhere before a good rain. Gather it after a good rain, or if you're gathering it, remember this is during the growing season, just spread it out somewhere when you know there's going to be a good rain, right? And just let it get rained on, or use your hose and water it down, that sort of stuff. All right. For some people like to take, so one of the questions is, do I need to chop it up? Do I need to shred it up? Because some of the pieces are, they're sort of big chunks and stuff like that. It's not necessary. It'll break down. Seaweed gets hot and breaks down fast. So you don't need to do any of that. But if you're trying to stretch out your seaweed, if you can only gather so much, if I went with a buddy of mine that's got a pickup truck, but if you're putting this in the back of the car, in my car, I might be able to get 2 or 3 of these containers, that's about it. So one good thing to do with the seaweed, if your lawn's in need of a good mow, is just spread it all out on the lawn. And if you've got any leaves or anything like that, throw that in with it and just put the bag on your lawnmower and just go for it, right? Mow that all up. So now you've got a combination of leaves, grass clippings, and seaweed. It's a really good mix. And there's reasons why you might want to do that, which I'll discuss later on here. But yeah, if you're trying to stretch it out and stretch it further, that's a good way to do it too. So you don't need to shred it. It'll break down on its own. But if you want to shred it, that's fine too. You can do that, especially if you want to sort of stretch it out. If you want to add it to multiple gardens and you want to basically thin it down with grass clippings and leaves and stuff like that, or hay or whatever, you can totally do that. Now, a common question I get about worms, slugs, and snails. You'll read on Facebook and different message boards that it kills worms, or it's bad for worms, or worms don't like it. That's total rubbish. I use it all over the place. And, there's plenty of beds I've gone to that are mulched with seaweed. Let's say you've got 2-3 inches of mulch on the seaweed, and it's like May, and you want to go trout fishing. You pull back the seaweed, and there's worms right there working on it, right? So it doesn't bother worms at all. In terms of slug and snails, there's the argument that, oh, they can't crawl across it because the salt is sharp and spiky and they don't like it. That's complete rubbish. If you're using seaweed, you're living somewhere coastal, it probably gets a mist or a dew every single night. And the seaweed is soft and slimy most of the time. Also, slugs and snails, they don't just move overground, they move underground. So anything that's sharp and spiky, they can just go underneath it. They can go underground. Where do you think they are during the day when you can't see them? They're underground, underneath things. They can go right underneath it. But most of the time your seaweed is sort of slimy, especially after a rain. It doesn't bother them at all. And again, the idea that seaweed is like pure salt is just rubbish. I mean, slugs and snails don't like salt, but there's very, very little seaweed, or there's very, very little salt in your seaweed, so it doesn't bother them at all. It is not a slug and snail deterrent. If anything, they probably eat it. Okay, like they basically eat decaying plant matter. They'll eat live plant matter in your garden too, but they eat decaying plant matter. I wouldn't be surprised if they eat it. Okay, so it does nothing to deter slugs and snails. They're perfectly happy, and happy as a pig in compost, right? In terms of, you know, I've done videos on this in the past about comparing different kinds of mulches. So I mean, the main mulches I use in my garden are grass clippings, hay, and leaves. That's the main, and seaweed. Okay, those are the main things I get because I can get them easily and for free. Okay, I live really close to the ocean. So in terms of heat, seaweed heats up a lot. If you get you know, 2-3 inches of seaweed, in terms of its ability to work, okay, so it breaks down quickly, it heats up, and it breaks down fast. So it's a good mulch in that sense. If you've got, you know, and it's dark in color, right, so it attracts the sunlight heat. So in early spring, if you've got something growing, you know, like let's say spinach or something like that, seaweed's a good mulch if you want to maintain the moisture levels in the soil, mulch the soil, and the seaweed will heat up in the sun, right? And it'll start to break down. And then whenever it rains, all those nutrients are being released, and you know, seaweed and spinach and seaweed are like brother and sister. They go so really, really well together, right? They're like ham and eggs, right? So it heats up a lot. In a compost pile, it provides a lot of heat. It just breaks down quickly and provides a lot of heat. In terms of moisture retention, it's probably, of all the kinds of mulch you can use, it's probably the worst for that. It's mostly water, so when it rains, the seaweed sucks up all the water. It doesn't really get through it. The seaweed's so good at taking water on, right? So if you've got, let's say, you know, a half an inch of rain, most of that's just going to be taken up by the seaweed. It won't go through it. And it's sort of porous. So I find like grass clippings, leaves, and hay much better for maintaining moisture levels in the soil. I did a video a number of years ago. I just went around in August when it was really dry and really hot, and I had watered my garden for 3 weeks, and I just jammed my hand in the ground everywhere with every single mulch, and the driest soil was the seaweed mulch soil. Still good for retaining moisture, just not as good as other mulches. But you know, you can remedy that by having an inch of seaweed and an inch of grass clippings, right? There you go, right? Because the grass clippings is more of a tighter weave sort of thing, right? So it sort of prevents the evaporation better. But, and not everything, if you've got there's certain parts of my garden where they don't get a lot of sunlight, they're a bit shady. So I don't need like an amazing moisture retaining salt or a moisture retaining mulch in a spot like that, so I can use it there. In terms of insulation, that is to say the ability of the mulch to maintain the temperature of the soil. Again, it doesn't perform as well as leaves, hay, and grass clippings. It's very porous. So if you've got a really, really cold night and you've got, let's say, 3 inches of hay on a garden bed, the soil might not be frozen. If you've got 3 inches of seaweed on the garden bed, the soil will probably get a bit frozen on a really cold night like that. But by contrast, if you've got a really sunny day, right, the seaweed will basically capture a lot of sun heat because it's dark in color, and it'll gather heat to itself in that way. So it does act as a sort of solar attractant. It does gather a lot of energy from the sun, so it's good in that way. So it's, you know, you take these things, you know, you've got your good, you've got your bad. But as an insulator, it's not very good as an insulator, but it's really good at attracting heat to itself. And in terms of weed seeds, as mulches go, it's better than hay and grass clippings. It doesn't tend to have, if you gather it correctly and you're not gathering it next to like a field of weeds. If you've got a pile of seaweed that's sort of bunched up against a field of weeds, right, and they're the kinds of weeds that can grow anywhere, then you're going to have those weeds in your garden. But if you're getting it sort of off the rocks and it's fresh seaweed and it's just coming off the sea, there's probably not a lot of weed seeds in that. So compared to, tree leaves are usually pretty good in terms of weed seeds. But compared to hay and grass clippings, it has less weed seeds in it in general, as a general rule. In terms of composting, this is a great thing to add to your compost pile, right? It's not super high in nitrogen, but it's got an N of 2, okay? and it gets hot. It really does heat up in a compost pile. So it's a good thing to layer in with leaves and stuff like that, okay? So definitely something you want to use for composting. Most of the composting on my garden just happens as mulch breaks down, right? I use things as mulch, they break down, they become compost, and they get worked into the soil by the soil organisms. But if you've got a compost pile or some sort of composting device, and you want to add this, this is a great thing to add to a compost pile. All right. Added bonuses of the seaweed using it as a mulch or a compost is that it has, it's there's a lot of other minerals in it, and it's got some things that are hard to find in a lot of other sort of natural mulch. If you happen to have minerally depleted soil, this is a good amendment to pick that up. Also, another thing that's in the seaweed, that's sort of the stuff that's pushed up on the shore in a big storm, there's a lot of dead aquatic insects in there, right? So you've got all the nutrients of that breaking down, the calcium and the different proteins and different things like that, right? That's part of the reason it can get so hot. If I went through here and looked really closely, I'd find a lot of dead aquatic insects and maybe even dead fish or pieces and hunks of rotting things, right? I mean, seaweed rots, it smells bad, right? So yeah, you get a lot more than just the seaweed when you collect seaweed. And I guess final point before I go put some of this stuff in the garden and show you how I do it, is to just speak to alternatives like liquid seaweed and all these sorts of liquid seaweed fertilizers, for seaweed products you can buy. Sure, you can buy all those things, and I'm sure they're going to be beneficial for your garden because they're going to have an NPK of 2.25 and 3.5. I mean, anything you add to the garden that has that is going to give your plants a boost. But if you live somewhere, Kansas or whatever, you live somewhere inland and you're nowhere near a lake or an ocean, you can't get seaweed or seaweed from a lake, or you can't get it, you don't need it. Like, I use it because it's like a 5-minute drive from my house, and I can get it for nothing. And I got a buddy that owns a truck, and once in a while we go and just, sort of make spend an hour of a day and get a bunch of seaweed. It's sort of a fun social thing to do. But you don't need it. You don't need to have seaweed. It's a great thing to use if you can get it, but you don't need to have it. And if you are unable to get seaweed, I would not run out and buy some sort of liquid seaweed fertilizer because you think you're just not going to have success without it. Really, I'd say the closest thing, in terms of like the speed it breaks down and the effect it has on the garden, the closest thing to seaweed, I would say, is grass clippings. Usually sometime around late July or mid-July, some of my beds, the mulches I have been broken down and they're getting kind of thin. I keep all the beds, I practice no-till gardening here, I keep all my garden beds covered with a mulch all the time. And sometime in this, I collect a lot of mulch in the fall, and then it really doesn't break down over the winter because it's just too cold for anything to happen. So really in the spring, I've got all kinds of mulch ready to go and everything's really well mulched. And at some point, July or early August, whatever, some of the mulches break down and there's not a lot left there, and I start getting risk of evaporation in the soil and weeds starting to germinate. Once you get bare earth, you start getting weeds like crazy. Keep your soil covered, you won't get weeds. So sometimes that time of year, I'll just, put the bag on and we mow the lawn. We usually have a mulching blade. We usually just don't have a bag on. We just let the grass, you just mulch it and leave it where it is. But if I need a mulch, just put the bag on and mow the lawn and use that. You put an inch of grass clippings on a garden bed, like let's say you're growing kale or something like that. Have a look at that garden after a week, especially if you've had a couple rains. It starts growing like it's been fertilized. I mean, grass, you take a wheelbarrow. If you've ever thrown a whole bunch of grass clippings in a wheelbarrow and left it for a couple days, it's hot in the center of that thing. It feels like the inside of a body, you know what I mean? It's hot in there, right? So grass breaks down fast, which means that the nutrients that are in the grass become plant available that much quicker. So if you're somewhere where you can't get seaweed, don't feel like you have to spend all kinds of money. I mean, if you want to do that, fine. I'm sure it'll work great, but don't feel like you have to. Your grass clippings will work just as fine as a mulch. And as long as you keep the garden mulched, you're not going to get that many weeds from it. I mean, I have a 2,500 square foot garden here. I use grass clippings all the time. If I was overwhelmed with weeds, I couldn't do this. Right? I got a wife, I got a kid, I have Got 2 kids, a wife, a full-time job, and other interests. There's no way I could, and you know, 2 YouTube channels. There's no way I could do all of that if I was inundated with weeds here, right? I might spend a couple hours a year weeding, that's it, right? So it's, yeah, it's really not the problem you think it is. Anyway, just a short version, a short thing to say, yes, this is a video on seaweed mulch, and it is a great thing, and it's very useful, and if you can get it for free, it's a good thing to get. But that said, if I lived inland, I wouldn't use it, and I just use grass clippings and leaves and whatever else I could find. Even if it was a long drive for me, I mean, it's a very short drive for me to the ocean. I'm only a couple kilometers from the ocean here. If I had to drive an hour to get to the ocean, I wouldn't bother with seaweed mulch. I just wouldn't, because there's other things that work just fine. But the point is, if you can get it and it's easy to get, use it. It's great. All right, so let's go throw a bit of this on one of my garden beds. I'll just show you basically how I get it on there. All right, let's go. All right, so here I got a bed, and yeah, this should have been leveled out before everything froze up, but I never got around to it. Doesn't matter. I'll do that later. So in spring, when everything's thawed out, I'll just rake the seaweed off and level this out. You can't get too worked up over these things. If you know, the main thing is you get it on there, get it somewhere. Hopefully, you see how this part's frozen a little bit, right? Hopefully at some point, see how dark it is? We got a nice sunny day. We got about 2 or 3 inches thick here. Gonna need another container for this bed here. This one's a little bit heavier. Yeah. Whoa. I think I might grow potatoes in this bed next year. I find potatoes seem to love seaweed. I don't know why. Maybe they need potassium. Now, I guess they do. If you think about it, they say a potato's got more potassium than a banana. So I guess that makes sense, because seaweed's high in potassium. It would be a good thing for potatoes. When you're planting potatoes as seaweed, I mean, sure, you can use it as a mulch on top, then potatoes will just grow right through it. You don't need to move it out of the way. But you can also, when you're digging the hole to put the potato in, put a little fistful of seaweed right in the hole with the potato. Does great. All right, so that's all you got to do. Now, this bed is not planting ready, because you saw it wasn't leveled out. So in the spring, I'll just take a rake. What I'll do is I'll scrape it back to here, level this side, push it over there, level that side. Good, and it'll be ready for planting. And when I plant the potatoes, I'll just make a little hole, stuff the potato in, put it all back. That's all I got to do. So this bed won't take any time at all to get planted with potatoes next spring. So anyway, I hope that was the ultimate gardening with seaweed video. I hope I hit on every question or concern people might have. It's a great mulch. It's a great compost amendment. It's a great soil amendment. You can sort of treat it like a manure in a sense, right? It breaks down very quickly. The plants love it. All that being said, you can get by just fine without it too. So don't let yourself get ripped off because you feel you need some magic syrup or magic pixie dust with seaweed in it. You can get by just fine without it if you live somewhere where there isn't seaweed. But if it's easy to get and it's nearby, you can get it for free and you don't got to drive too far, especially if you've got a friend with a pickup truck. It's a great thing to apply to your garden. And late fall, early winter, if things aren't too cold, good time to deal with it. All right, so I hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please like, share, subscribe. Click the bell if you want to be notified when I do new videos. And until next time, get out there, get at it, have fun in your garden. Thanks for watching.